German cities are picturesque. This is a common way of thinking. In the collective imagination, they're full of half-timber-bird houses, neo-Gothic churches, market squares with a medieval feel, cobblestone streets and historic facades, all bathed in an amber glow. It's a fairy tale vision, one that's been sold to us by postcards and travel brochures since we were kids. But spend any amount of time walking around Germany and you'll realize soon enough that this picture is not entirely accurate. Because while there are indeed many towns and cities that have managed to retain much of their historical charm, there are just as many that haven't. And the reason for that has to do with a very particular chapter in Germany's turbulent history. In 1945, when the Allied bombing campaign came to an end, 6.5 million people were homeless in Germany. A country that had been whole just 2 years before was now divided into 4 occupation zones. The destruction wrought by the war was so extensive that nothing would ever be the same again. Entire city blocks were gone, reduced to rubble. Some cities were completely destroyed. 80% of Dresden's buildings were burned to the ground. Only 2% of those in Berlin still stood. So it's no surprise that when faced with such unprecedented levels of destruction, the question of how to rebuild took priority over the question of how to rebuild beautifully. Let's take Stuttgart for example. Before the war, the city had been home to around 20 distinct architectural styles, from Gothic to Baroque, Classical, Renaissance, and beyond. But after the war, when 80% of its housing stock had been obliterated, there was little appetite for recreating that architectural diversity. Instead, a competition was held in which the jury's task was simple: design a house that could be built quickly, cheaply, and above all, efficiently. The winning design, submitted by architect Johannes Ludwig, featured clean lines, flat roofs, balconies and small green shutters, a typical example of what would become known as German post-war functionalism. Over the course of the next few decades, countless variations of it would be built across the country. It wasn't long before the same approach started being applied to larger building projects too. In 1953, Berlin's first large-scale housing estate, known as the Märkische Viertel, was completed. Designed by architect Walter Gropius, it was originally meant to house 10,000 people, but ultimately ended up accommodating 23,000 residents in a series of identical prefabricated apartment blocks arranged in straight rows. There were communal gardens, schools, shops, sports facilities, and even public transport links. It was a self-contained community built according to modernist principles and intended to be a shining example of how Germans could live together peacefully in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophic war. The idea was that everyone would live in these new estates for a few years until better housing options became available. But of course, that never happened. By the end of the 1960s, the housing shortage had eased somewhat, but people continued to move to the cities. So instead of tearing down the apartment blocks, as originally planned, the authorities simply kept building them. One by one, more and more German cities began to look alike. Today, the typical German city has a strange double structure to it. In the center, there's usually a well-preserved old town with grand old buildings from times gone by. Then right on the edge of that, there's a clearly defined border, like a wall. And on the other side of that wall is the ugly part, a sea of grey, featureless high-rise buildings, sterile, soulless, uniform. This is what most German cities look like. The shift to modernist design wasn't restricted to housing. Between 1950 and 1970, almost 700 railway stations were built across West Germany. Most of them were designed in the same style: Bauhaus, glass, steel, and reinforced concrete. Main train stations like those in Hanover, Frankfurt, and Stuttgart look like oversized factories. They share a distinct lack of ornamentation. Even clocks, which used to be a staple of station design, were considered too decorative and were dispensed with altogether. The result is a series of austere, practically identical structures that do the job, but which are far from beautiful. It's tempting to see this sameness as a sign of German austerity and seriousness, even a weakness, but that's a misreading. The repetition wasn't just about saving money or time. It was also a symptom of something else, namely the chaos that reigned in Germany's cities in the immediate aftermath of the war. With entire city centers destroyed, with thousands dead and hundreds of thousands homeless, there simply wasn't anyone to preserve. Things that didn't seem to matter anymore were grand cathedrals, gabled houses, or even street names. The German states couldn't afford to send people to clean up streets that had already been cleared of rubble. What mattered was getting people back into homes and offices as fast as possible. So for a while, there was a complete absence of design control. Planning departments were overwhelmed. The mayors of Germany's big cities needed to house hundreds of thousands of people, and they did whatever they could to get it done. At the time, there were only 3 types of buildings that could be mass-produced at low cost: standardized industrial buildings, prefabricated panel buildings, and the buildings produced by the so-called Kleinwohnungsbau, a system that consisted of stacking small single rooms on top of each other. Of those 3 options, the last was by far the cheapest, the easiest, and the quickest to build. That's why in the 1950s, small room buildings like this were everywhere. This photo shows Munich in 1957. Look closely and you'll notice that every window is exactly the same size and shape. And in fact, every second window in the whole city was painted black, because it was covered with plywood, a cheap solution to a housing emergency that made the city look like a giant patchwork quilt. Today, 60 years later, many of these windows have been modernized, but the basic form of the buildings remains the same. What makes this story particularly striking is the role that bureaucracy played in shaping the way German cities look today. As the states began rebuilding, they drew up new plans for what their cities should look like. But since no one had any real idea of what the cities of the future would need, they decided to follow the path of least resistance and issue strict rules that allowed for very little deviation. Take automobile-centric urban planning, for example. By the 1960s, it was clear that Germany's love affair with the automobile was here to stay. So local governments decided to make the cities more car-friendly. Sounds like a good idea. But since no one really knew how to plan a city for cars, each municipality decided to solve the problem in its own way. The result was utter chaos. One day you could be driving through a German city center, admiring its old buildings and enjoying the quiet. Then suddenly you'd reach the outskirts of town and find yourself surrounded by billboards, gas stations, fast food, restaurants, supermarkets, shopping malls, and 6-lane highways. Another day you'd enter another city and experience the same jarring transition. Welcome to Germany, where the cities are modernized and efficient, but not necessarily beautiful. It's easy to get frustrated by all this, to think that surely things could have been done better. But the truth is that the chaotic nature of the changes made in the immediate aftermath of the war left little room for anything else. The scale of the destruction was simply too great to allow for a coherent response. Whole city blocks were wiped out, along with the records of what had stood there before. So new buildings were erected wherever they could be, and however they could be, often without any consultation or consensus. For example, one minute you're standing in Cologne looking at the magnificent Romanesque facade of the Hauptbahnhof, the main train station. Then the next you're outside on a platform staring at a blank, featureless wall. In front of you is a 6-track mainline railway station from 1911. Behind you is a new housing development. Looking for some symmetry, you cross the tracks to the opposite platform, only to be confronted by yet another featureless wall. You walk all the way down the platform and find a narrow gap between a long office block and the old station building. And there, you finally spot it, a stairwell containing 3 toilets, Cologne's architectural equivalent of a Mexican restaurant in Vegas. This tension between the old and the new is what German cities are all about. When you walk around a place like Cologne, it's hard not to be struck by the lack of continuity between the old buildings and the new ones. The old buildings are romantic, medieval, picturesque, uneven. The new ones are brutalist, imposing, alienating, inhuman. How on earth did this happen? Well, it happened because the old buildings were rescued and restored, while the new ones were built according to the principles of modernist urban planning. The trouble is that these two ways of thinking are basically incompatible. We either want our city centers to be functional, or they want them to be pretty. We can't have both. In the end, what we have to realize is that the so-called ugly cities weren't deliberately designed to be ugly. They were merely the unintended consequence of a series of deliberate decisions taken by individuals and institutions in the aftermath of a catastrophe. That's why they're not beautiful, because they were never meant to be. But that doesn't mean that they're bad. Just because we tend to prefer old, picturesque buildings to new, austere ones, it doesn't mean that one is automatically better than the other. In fact, the opposite is often true. The old buildings were often built in a time when there was little regard for hygiene, safety, or basic human needs. While the new ones may not be all that aesthetically pleasing, they are safer, more hygienic, and more functional. Ultimately, it's up to us to decide which qualities we value more.